Get started. We will call Ron up to do Charter School USA transition plan.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I get to speak to you all once you have food, because I know it was getting a little lengthy there before lunch.
I want to note those who wanted this a fast break are not in attendance yet. Just note.
For the record.
But go ahead. Yes, just for the record.
So the proposal you have in front of you is to kickstart the process. I want to clarify, to kickstart the process to kind of mirror what we did in Gary Community Schools to facilitate the planning for a transition of a turnaround academy out of intervention. And this is pursuant to the board's action with Charter Schools USA turnaround academies back in August, where the board expressed the intent, did not take formal action, but expressed the intent to transition the schools out of turnaround status following the 1920 school year. So I would open it up for any questions about the memo, or if you need any additional clarification, I'd be happy to provide that.
I do have a couple questions.
Of course.
So is it 10 or how's this getting funded? Through SIGs?
No, this would be funded through, as I understand, the board's budget.
Oh, okay. And my next question is, and this is me just asking, so this is a lot in advance, what, like 16 months in advance of that? So you're thinking you're just getting a jump start, early start, because there's going to be a lot of data in between there.
So here's exactly, and here's kind of the consideration that was taken when presenting this at this time and thinking through the timeline. There's really no good time, right, to ever make a decision about the future of a school. There's always going to be something or risks or circumstances that we're going to have to take into account. But most importantly, I think it's the children, the families, and the staff at each of these three schools. Board staff and the recommendation is really rooted in the fact that we want to make sure they have a clear understanding of what's going to happen after 2020 by the time the 1920 school year starts. So nobody goes into that school year, as they did in this past school year, with the kind of uncertainty of what's going to happen in the future. So the goal here would be to put together a transition plan, you're right, prior to that last school year. So that would be 1 year of data worth that we wouldn't be able to look at, but we would have 7 years, I believe.
And you have Dr. Fairby's support, I'm assuming?
So Dr. Fairby has historically expressed kind of deference to the board's approach to this work, so I cannot say that I have his support.
Okay.
However, the memo does talk through that after kicking off this process, we will engage the corporation in conversations around what they would like to see the aspects of this program look like.
Okay, perfect. Do we have we don't have enough votes. Oh yes, we're good. Okay, so do we have a motion to accept the approval of the consultation position for CSUSA transition?
So moved.
Is there a second? Any other questions, concerns?
Yeah, one more.
Yes.
So this is a consulting contract to help facilitate the design of a school transition plan. Is that to not be under SBOE supervision, or is it actually contemplating transition to IPS or somebody else? Or
The short answer is yes, and if I could add a little bit of detail. So yes, it is to transition them out of turnaround status, as the board expressed was their intent. The statutory side is 2031-99 that talks about the board's responsibilities for considering what to do with a turnaround academy. The options include directing the special management, a turnaround academy operated by a special management team in this particular circumstance. The options include directing the special management team to seek charter authorization to continue operating the school as a charter school, to return the school back to the corporation, or the third option is to assign a new intervention. Now, I think looking at the board's statements from August, it would seem that the only two options underneath the existing options, right, would be to close or merge. Because if we assign any other options, then really what we're doing is we're continuing the turnaround academy status and the oversight of the board. So I think the answer is yes. The goal is to transition them out of turnaround based on the board's statement.
So they're under who's the watchdog for?
Currently?
Extending forward, who will be the watchdog for this? I missed the answer to that.
Yeah, so moving forward, because we extended the contracts through 2020, Through the 1920 school year, these schools will remain turnaround academies under the purview of the state board.
So Ron, given that there are others besides these particular schools, I'm assuming that person would service more than just these entities, given that we may have more to come?
So, can you clarify by more to come?
Well, if you have schools on track to be in this situation, I'm assuming if we get in that situation that this person, are they going to be exclusive to these schools, or can we broaden that up?
I think the current proposal would mirror what occurred in Gary, where it was a annual one-year contract to support the transition of that particular turnaround academy. I will say that these three schools are the only schools currently being operated by a special management team, which creates a really unique dynamic where it has been operated by an entity outside of the school corporation, so therefore there are two parties kind of to interact with, as opposed to in Evansville, for example, where there are turnaround academies that aren't operated by a special management team. If they want to transition those out of the transformation zone and transition the schools out of turnaround altogether and seek the board's approval for that, that would be a conversation between, I think, staff and them, which we would have the capacity to do.
To be a resource for others beyond just this.
I would say no, not currently. And because I would say we wouldn't need external resources to facilitate a conversation between Evansville and board staff and the board.
Okay.
Because Evansville would lead a lot of the community engagement because it's a unilateral. Right now, I'm not comfortable with CSUSA unilaterally leading community engagement or IPS unilaterally leading community engagement on an issue that has kind of dueling parties that's under the board's preview. I think it's important that the board plays a role, obviously consulting with both of those parties very closely, but the board plays the ultimate role in facilitating that process.
Okay. Any other questions? DJ?
Just a comment. I applaud you for getting way out in front of this. I think it's always comforting. I had the opportunity yesterday to spend some time at TC Howe with the CSUSA folks, and the work that's going on there is really impressive. So I love the fact that we're going to have things ironed out so those teachers can spend their time doing what they should be doing as opposed to wondering what the next year is going to hold. So job well done.
Any other comments? Tony, sorry.
So Ron, IPS has indicated they don't want, at least two of these schools, correct?
So I can speak directly to the official action that the IPS board has taken. So the IPS board, the governing body, has taken official action to state that should these schools be returned to the corporation as a part of their plan to reinvent high school and IPS, that they would close both buildings, and that has an official action by their board.
I'm sorry for coming in late, but I caught maybe the end of a comment you were making where you suggested there were only two options.
Yeah, so let me review the options again under 2031-99 for transitioning a school that is operated by a special management team. The board is required after 5 years. In this case, the timeline is actually not hit, but the board has stated the intent to do so, and they have the authority to do it earlier if they wish, or if you wish. The options are to direct the school to seek a charter and continue operating the school as a charter outside of turnaround status, to return the school back to the corporation, or to select another option under the original list. And what I stated was that original list, which includes multiple options, there are only two that remove it from turnaround, which is the board directly closing it or the board merging the school, directing the school to merge with another. Any other option would keep the school in turnaround.
So on the seek a charter option, what does that look like? I mean, they just start from scratch to any charter operator, I guess even maybe IPS.
So let me be clear, so I want to make sure, you said operator, are you talking about operator or authorizer?
Authorizer.
Yeah, so yes, we would direct.
So it would just be the regular charter process that all schools go through to get a charter under the current statute.
As the language reads now, and I could happily seek additional support from council if they want to give a deeper interpretation, as the language reads now.
So they will have been under jurisdiction of this board, close monitoring operation for 5+ years, but yet you start off just as a new entity seeking a charter with all the procedures required of a new startup.
I would say that as I understand the language right now, that is my understanding of the language right now, yes. That doesn't mean that an authorizer couldn't potentially modify their procedure for this particular case, but there's no statutory authority outside of just directing the school to seek a charter, from what I understand.
Tim, does the actual language, what does the actual language say with regards to the turnaround statute for that option?
I don't have the, I'm sorry, I don't have the specific language in front of me, and actually I think this is potentially a little more complex question than it might appear, and my suggestion would be that, working with Ron, I could give you a personalized answer later.
Well, just explain to me why you think it may be more complex.
I'm saying I don't know the answer right now, and I don't want to give you an answer when I'm not sure.
Okay. So as it stands now, do you agree with what Ron's saying and what I think, that we do not have the authority to in any way mandate or be involved in that chartering process, and they would just be applying as a new startup?
That's, like I said, that, excuse me, I apologize. No, I'm just getting over a cold, so I apologize. I believe that sounds like an accurate summary, but at the same time, without actually reviewing it and anything else that might be related to that particular statute and chapter, I think I owe you a more in-depth response.
That's fine. Did you just pull the statute? Is that what you did? What's the language say?
So the language explicitly states that one of the options is to, quote, direct the special management team to apply to a charter school authorizer for charter school status for the school.
To direct them to apply
Yes, sir.
to a charter operator. Okay.
Charter authorizer.
A charter
Not
authorizer.
correct, sorry.
I keep saying that. Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions? Okay, roll call, please.
Yes. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. The next item is the proposed accountability rule.
All right. Good afternoon. Sure.
Oh, I'm sorry. Steve Baker, are you causing problems?
Yes, ma'am, I am. If it makes you feel better, that's not the first time it's happened, so I will not take that personally. I will not. So thank you for listening to my comments today. I do appreciate it. My name is Steve Baker, principal of Bluffton High School for the last 19 years. Just want to give you a little background on the accountability model that you'll be looking at today and the people who put it together. The most recent ESSA Accountability Committee consisted of 15 members from a variety of educational backgrounds, including state board staff, representative from the governor's office, state board members Kerry Wicker, David Freitas, Marianne McMahon, and me. We had 4 meetings, 3 hours each, about 12 hours. This was after many meetings across the state with hundreds of stakeholders, led by Dr. McCormick and the DOE staff. There was a consensus among the group to recommend the original accountability model, and I do believe the process was extremely transparent. This new proposed accountability model, in my opinion, changes the framework of the foundation of the recommendation from the Accountability Committee. This is more than just tweaks and adjustments. It changes the foundation for which this model was built upon. A few highlights: it adds social studies and science at the middle school and elementary level. It adds on-track indicator at the high school. It eliminates growth totally at the high school. That's huge, huge. It pushes achievement from high school for proficiency from 15% to 25% to 30%, so it will double by 22-23 school year. That's huge. Some of these topics never came up during any of our accountability meetings, so studies and science were discussed, but the group decided the fifth indicator would not be academic in nature. This proposed rule, this new one, places much more emphasis on proficiency of tests, and it does go against public input. Throughout this process, stakeholders stressed that the importance of including measures that captures how students improve, not just how they did at one moment in time. High school especially, they stressed, is a four-year comprehensive experience, not just one test. Since a high school test is in limbo, it is premature to eliminate growth at the high school level at this stage. We don't know what the high school assessment will be or when it will be implemented. We could have I-STEP grade 10 again next school year in 18-19, just like we did this year in 17-18, in which we had growth. If we go to SAT, we should still have the chance to explore growth as an option. I know the statement has been made that growth masks the true measurement of what is happening in our schools. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think proficiency masks what is truly happening in our schools. When the state average is 35-36% in math, grade 10, I do not believe that is indicative of what is happening in our schools. I believe proficiency masks, not growth. The results of the SAT test could have similar pass rates of our I-STEP grade 10 math, which is mid-30s. If the high school has no growth and we're using 30% proficiency, which doubles in 2022-23, this would hurt schools and students. For example, I know this model very well. I plugged in Bluffton High School numbers. I would go from an A to a C based upon the proposed changes in green. This affects my school and it affects my students. So this leads to my question. Why are we changing it? Where's the problem? I'm not talking about public input, timeline. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about the green. Why? Listening to Dr. Yeager read Education Insight was very informative that it's one of the top 10 ESSA plans in the state. We must have done something right. I was also invited to Washington, D.C. in October to talk to congressional staff members because Indiana ESSA's plan was so good. And I appreciate the Department of Ed for helping me prepare for that. Because ESSA's plan and accountability model was so good, I was called to D.C. to talk to congressional members. We must be doing something right. Some concerning precedent is being set. Transparency and working with educators is necessary for the success of Indiana schools. And there's a difference between transparency among 11 board members and among hundreds and thousands of stakeholders. So to recap, ESSA Accountability Plan was drafted over months with input from a committee of experts, including state board members and hundreds of stakeholders, discussed at state board meetings, went through the governor's office, sent to the feds. They liked it with just a few changes, and now there are changes in green. This is frustrating and disappointing to me. In conclusion, I know you have the authority to do this. I get it. I just don't understand why it's being done this way. It does lack transparency to us educators. It's buried in 20 pages of legalese. Not one educator I've talked with knew anything about this when it came out January 3rd, yet this plan will affect every school in the state of Indiana. Mr. Henry, thank you for your comments because I do believe you speak of what a lot of educators are frustrated about, and I appreciate you being that voice. I cannot speak for every educator, but I will speak for me and say you are speaking for me, so thank you. Thank you. I ask you to approve the original accountability rule as is. It was sent to the feds who approved it, the one that was recommended by the committee and has been given with some small recommendations to improve. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Steve. Are there other comments, Matt, or are we good, Matt? Are there other public comments for that, or are we good? Okay. Add your up.
Right. I appreciate it. It's late in the afternoon. Make sure I
Thanks, you too.
this thing. We're going to start a little bit today talking about accountability. And what I want to run through, and this is probably failure on my part to adequately inform the board about the process that was going to go forward when the board adopted the recommendation in July of last year. But today we're going to talk a little bit about the administrative rulemaking process and why that's important to us. The proposed rule that you have in front of you right now, including the timeline that led up to how we got to that rule, board feedback that's been incorporated into that, and then the feedback received generally, and then a little bit of an outline about how the board should probably think about proceeding going forward. So under 422.2, the state board is bound by this when looking at adopting administrative rules, which is what the accountability model is. I can certainly appreciate this group of 15 experts putting in work on behalf of the Department of Education in helping with their federal ESSA plan, but the fact of the matter is that the accountability rule lies within the purview of the State Board of Education, and the rulemaking process that the State Board of Education has to follow is not dictated by the federal law or ESSA. It's dictated by 422.2. So with that, we've gone on, we've moved forward and reached out to LSA to file our notice of intent. But as far as the transparency is concerned, there will be public hearings. And the statute only requires one public hearing be held, but we're certainly not encouraging the board limit itself to that. My recommendation as one of the councilors of this board would be that the board hold a number of public hearings. I think, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but the last accountability rule received over 2,000 public comments. Is that roughly? So, you know, I don't think that the board should necessarily hold one public hearing. They should probably look at holding multiple, and they don't have to be here in Indianapolis. That's been past practice when it comes to rules that are not as controversial or have not received as much fanfare as this rule. But we can certainly, staff would be happy to move the public hearings around the state to ensure that everybody has an opportunity. In addition to that, public comments may be sent into the board via email as well as by phone or written letter. Tim and I, working with the interns, will ensure that the board receive a summary of every single public comment that comes in, and that you guys are able to consider that. And in fact, by law, you are required to consider those public comments. You're not required to incorporate them, but you are required to consider them, and we will ensure that you do that. So how did we get to where we are today? Leading up to July, the Department of Education was working on their ESSA plan, and they presented a number of times to this board. In July, the board adopted a recommendation put forward to them to open up the rulemaking process, and in that recommendation that was adopted, you directed staff to reach out to LSA to inform them that we'd had permission to continue with the rulemaking process. Very shortly thereafter, beginning on August 1st, actually, there were working groups dealing with ESSA. I would certainly encourage board members to review the video from the August 1st meeting, where there was quite a lengthy debate about the fact that the rulemaking had to happen and that nobody should expect that the final rule that comes out mirrors the ESSA plan put forward by the department. And that was the consensus adopted by the board at that time. From there, DOE staff offered to draft the first version of the proposed rule, and I have to give them a lot of credit. They certainly did not have to do that for us, but they did while they were working on their own ESSA plan. And the rule that they drafted very much mirrored the ESSA plan. It was a combination of the rule that's currently in the register, modified by what was in the ESSA plan. From that point forward, through our October meetings, a number of board members in public meetings expressed their desire to see certain things reflected in the rule. I took note of that, and that's what began the green changes that were made. And I'm going to use the word changes because I think that a lot of people are expecting that the ESSA plan be the baseline, but I think it's probably more accurate to look at the rule that the board currently has on the books as the baseline. Like I said, if no modification is made to the board's current rule, the board will continue placing schools and giving letter grades based on current rule, not ESSA. So please don't be confused that if the board does nothing, the current rule, not ESSA, not a modified version of ESSA, will be used to place schools. From there, sorry, was there a question? From there in November, I circulated a draft that included green comments to everybody, asked for additional feedback. As you've heard, some board members did offer additional feedback. That was incorporated into the draft. And then there was some things that came up through the Department of Ed, the Indiana Department of Ed's call with the U.S. Department of Ed feedback about the ESSA plan in general. And because the board had expressed an interest in aligning the accountability rule to the extent possible With ESSA, some of those changes were then incorporated, as the superintendent pointed out, in December, late December. So that brings us to today, where the recommendation is simply that this board adopt language that we can publish for purposes of beginning the rulemaking process. This language is not binding on the board. However, it is a starting point that we will use to accumulate public comments and receive public feedback. Once it is published, again, there will be public comments provided, and this board is free to change the rule based on those comments as they see fit. We're simply asking or recommending that you approve language to begin that rulemaking process.
Okay.
Yes, please.
If I may. Yeah, Superintendent. Could we go back and just start with the language in the proposed rule consistent with ESSA?
Absolutely. If that's what this board wanted to do, you could do that. No official action and no final action has been taken by this board up till now with respect to modifications to the proposed accountability rule. We hear talk of 3 board members participating in a 15-member panel. Unfortunately, that was for federal purposes only, and it takes 6 board members to do anything by statute. I used the department's ESSA plan as the starting point for the accountability rule, again, just because that was the interest expressed by this board at the time, stemming from that August 1st meeting. Other than that, there was no directive to use the ESSA plan. There was no directive to deviate from the ESSA plan. It was simply the convenient starting point based on the conversations you all had had.
And just one more comment. I mean, I guess from my standpoint, that would be the logical starting point for a formal public comment period. And then, all of us could discuss at a board meeting what potential changes or updates we might have to that as the baseline, and certainly take the public comment. But it just seems to me like there's things incorporated into this draft that haven't really been vetted. And so that's what concerns me about using this as a starting point and baseline is there's not real consensus on this, whereas with the ESSA language there was consensus, if I'm not mistaken. So I guess from my vantage point, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe there wasn't, but I just think it's a more logical place to start the process rather than what the language is contained in this current draft. So,
yeah, and you are absolutely correct that there's no consensus on the language that's in front of you today, which is why I highlighted some of that language in green so you could see what some of your fellow board members had suggested be added. But I would back up and say that there was no consensus around using the original ESSA plan either. Like I said, there was please.
In August, though, at a board meeting.
That's what I thought we voted on.
We voted on it in August, and there was consensus. There was compromise. BJ and I talked back and forth about 42.5%, and he wanted more proficiency, and I wanted more growth. And at one point, BJ even said, well, if you lose a little and I lose a little, then everybody's a winner. There was consensus in terms of compromise, and so at least there had been discussion and compromise and agreement on some things at that meeting.
But Carrie, there was never a vote. I think we'd be very careful about that. There was never a vote on the accountability metrics in ESSA. And I disagree with you somewhat, Gordon. I disagree substantially with some of the things in the ESSA accountability model. But what was discussed was this doesn't change anything anyway. It's just a plan. Ultimately, to change any accountability in the state, you have to go through a rulemaking process. So we just held back and waited for the rulemaking process to address our issues. And then once we started working on an actual draft, I know I was very forward in making sure the things I was interested in sort of made their way into a proposed draft. The other thing I think we have to consider, Gordon, is that in the interim between ESSA being submitted and now, we passed graduation pathways. And I think it'd be fundamentally flawed to start out with a base model of a rule that doesn't take into account the major shift we just made with graduation pathways. Because what we've done is sort of moved away from being so reliant upon just the standardized testing in the evaluation of these schools to considering whether or not kids are actually graduating from these schools. So I think that has to be a part of any baseline rule that we vote on.
And Tony, if I may just respond, Madam Chair, I appreciate and respect your position, and I understand where you're coming from. I'm really, again, just to revisit what I said before about putting the cart before the horse. I just feel like in the context of the discussion that, I feel like we should be having today, it would be to update a baseline potentially. But I just feel like, and I'm not lobbing any dispersions towards the staff, because I know you're in a very difficult situation of, having 11 people up here, providing plenty of input. But just from a process standpoint, it seems to me to be more logical to start with what our baseline was, where there was, I think, at least consensus on this board, maybe not unanimous, but consensus. And, I just think that that's where we should have started. We probably created a little bit more consternation than we needed to across the state, so I just feel that, just from where I'm sitting today, I would feel more comfortable and I would be happy to support moving forward with the rulemaking process under the language that there was general consensus. And then that's when we can get, input from board members as well as, the folks out in the field as to potential changes all through as part of a formal process, rather than kind of, to me, there's a bias in what we've presented because it's come from, certain quarters and it really hasn't been vetted. And, obviously we can do that today, but in my view, that's not the logical way for us as a state board of education to run the process.
And let me be absolutely clear that, of course, staff is not going to go forward with a rule that you haven't approved as a board. So if that's the will of the board, we will absolutely make those modifications to the draft before submitting it to LSA for publication in the register. So I mean, like I said, this was truly a baseline that was reflective of the input I've received from board.
Okay, well, so just if I can finish, I'm sorry, Katie. Katie, if I can just make one last point, which is I think we could save ourselves a whole lot of discussion and debate today if we were to take the approach that I'm suggesting as opposed to what's currently on the table. So I would just make that point so that we're, 1:45. I mean, I'm happy to stay all day, but, I think we can circumvent that and make a lot of people out there across the state happier with the process going forward. Thank you.
Kate, did you have a comment?
Yes, please. I want to go back to a point that you raised earlier, Gordon, when you were going back through sort of the particulars of procedure and Robert's rules and interactions and the way that we should treat one another. And I do think it's important that we all acknowledge sort of the clearly documented facts and the records of the conversations that we have had. And on August 1st, that work session was recorded and it was documented, and a transcript of our conversations could be produced, and there are probably informal notes about that. But during that conversation, we all had very, very candid, intellectual, soundboarding conversations about the challenging and shifting landscape that we were working to steer the state through, and that there were going to be new facts that were going to come to us, and we would have to react, and we would have to govern and legislate and move policy forward accordingly. And I think that in fairness to one another, all of these different viewpoints and what is captured in the proposed rule, not those precise words, right? Because grad pathways hadn't happened, different legislation and clarification from US DOE had not come forth, DOE had taken different action. But I think to any way suggest that there is a lack of transparency or authenticity in the statements that have been made, it's something that we should not do to one another. And so I just want to articulate that I think all of those viewpoints are captured in that August 1st work session. We all received that same email on November 17th, and we responded to it in ways that were authentic to our service. Some folks chose to wait. Some folks gave verbal feedback. Some folks gave written feedback. And the way one responded to that is not better than another method. And so I just think, again, as we move through this, I hope that we can honor one another in terms of being true to those facts. And I think that the repeated use of the word transparency to suggest that providing input was violative of our role as a state board member, I hope is something that we will not do.
Okay, and so I just want to respond. That was absolutely not my point this morning or now.
Thank you for clarifying that, because I think it could have been misunderstood.
Okay, well, that's certainly, the board is allowed to provide input at any time, and I'm not calling into question the transparency of board members sending emails to staff. That's perfectly fine. What I was saying was that I think it could be perceived that the board, as a board, by starting where we are today, and not really providing what I would consider a reasonable amount of time for there to be public input and consideration. That's the transparency issue. It's not calling into question any particular board member and how they sought to communicate with staff. Really, it was geared towards this new language, which a lot of people didn't see until the first of the year, after the first of the year. So that was my point as to transparency. I think it's a fair point, and it certainly wasn't calling into question any particular board member and what they've done.
And again, at a minimum, the public will have 56 days to digest this rule before we can even move on beyond the public comment period. So I think there's quite a bit of time, February meetings and March meetings as well, where the board can certainly consider public comment. And again, I'm not advocating that the board take the minimum amount of time to consider public comment. I would suggest going beyond the minimum amount, but 56 days is the minimum amount of time that this rule will be out there before it's even eligible to move on beyond the public comment period.
PJ?
I would like to reiterate Vince's point from earlier. I think after the public input is done and there is a final rule, the most important feedback is on that final rule.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that.
That's why I would differ from Gordon. I don't care what we start with, but I do think it's important that folks know what the people sitting up here what they would recommend as changes. I think that's important for everyone to know. So whether or not we use the original draft or leave the green highlights, I think everyone would want to know what the thought process is here. But I think the most important conversations we're going to have are after this board approves a final rule. So I hope that we allow for time.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the amount of time that you have as a board to debate whatever comes out of this process is contingent upon moving forward sooner rather than later. Like I said, we need to have something available for publication in the next 28 days to stay on the timeline that we think is necessary to ensure that this is in place before the start of next school year. So with that, I will generally summarize some of the comments that board members made.
Before you go, may I, point of clarification. So if we look at the process around grad pathways, we had multiple community meetings, stakeholder meetings, came up with a proposal, it was presented to the state board, we took hours of testimony, and we voted.
Mm-hmm.
I want to contrast that with what this process will look like. In this case, we have proposal going to go out for public comment. We're going to get a lot of public comment, and there are going to be presumably adjustments made, modifications made to the current draft.
I think that's an assumption, but that's up to you as a board.
Right, but I'm saying that it is likely that there could be.
It is likely, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And if so, then what is, from that point, how will those changes be made? And then what is the process after those changes are made? Because what I don't want to do is get to a place in which we get public comment, changes are made, and then the final draft comes to the board for approval on that day, and there's no possibility for additional input that could change the final draft.
And if I may put Brian on the spot to explain what the board's past practices have been.
We would certainly want to prevent that from happening by bringing a draft final rule to the board before for discussion and even maybe multiple discussions. And what I always go back to is REPA 3, which is the last really significant rule, lengthy rule the board engaged in rulemaking. And in that case, when we put out the proposed rule, we received even more public comment than the last accountability rule, and there were some areas that board members disagreed on. And so in those meetings in between, we'd pull out those items and have the board vote on them to try to progress towards the final rule. But even when we got to the point where we had what we thought was a final draft, the board's doesn't have to just approve it and then it's done. It can be on for discussion for additional public comments on what that final draft rule would look like. There's flexibility there, I guess.
Would it be helpful to share what that process is going to look like with, so that they're aware that this isn't give us public comment and we're going to come with a final draft and we're going to vote? It is an ongoing process to get to a final proposal. This question, is that something we could share and articulate with people?
Certainly, yep.
So again, to summarize some of the general comments that I heard from the board, compliance with Indiana law, I think that's a given, being that we're a state board. Board members wanted alignment with the state's ESSA plan to the extent possible. To be frank, there are just instances where Indiana law and the ESSA laws conflict. One example is dropout recovery services. Indiana law says that those students may not be included in a school's calculation. I think under ESSA, those students are going to have to be included in the calculation for purposes of determining comprehensive or targeted support. Again, the way we treat small schools by giving them a null grade, I think, is not exactly consistent with ESSA, where every school has to be placed according to that. So there are going to be instances where our rule will deviate from federal law, which is fine. The other thing I heard was board members wanted it to be effective beginning with the 2018-2019 school year. If the board has changed its mind on that, we can certainly discuss that. There was a request for staff to look into additional measures of school quality and student success. One in particular was discipline, measures of school discipline, and then just other general means to supplement attendance as the indicator for the K-8 model, as well as an indicator of school quality and student success once we figured out what was going to happen with the CCR indicator at the high school level.
I'm just asking this. So how did you solicit the board feedback prior to the green?
So there was no solicitation. These are things that board members reached out on their own accord.
Okay.
Reached out to staff and asked staff to do research into something.
There was no purposeful attempt to gain feedback prior to the green coming out.
So no, because prior to the green coming out, I had just been taking notes in meetings, and like I said, then there were board members who reached out on their own accord. It was at that point when I started incorporating those things into the draft that I realized that there was quite a few changes that board members had requested, and felt that it was appropriate to solicit feedback from the entire board at the same time to ensure that everybody was able to have a voice. So that's how that happened. Then college and career readiness, one of the things that I heard consistently was that graduation pathways had to be incorporated into the new draft, which is why you see changes to the CCR indicator. And then finally, graduation rate. There's been a lot of talk about Indiana's graduation rate, the general diploma, and the issues that's caused. While aligning with ESSA, which currently I understand that there's legislation out there at the state level that might change Indiana's diploma structure. But as it currently stands, there was board members expressed the idea that we should be providing relief to schools for things that they had been doing already. That it would be unfair to hold schools accountable for a change in the way we calculate graduation rate based on the fact that there are juniors and seniors getting ready to graduate or coming up, that it might be too late to put them back on or get them back to a Core 40 track. So it was expressed that we did not want to punish schools. We didn't want to play gotcha. So the suggestion was to transition over a 2-year period, which is why there's some language in the rule that suggests that for state accountability purposes, the general diploma would remain part of that calculation until I think 2021. So to comment on some of the specific issues here, so additional measures of school quality and student success, again, this came from...
Can I interrupt you just a second?
Yeah.
Before we move on to the green, in full disclosure, I wouldn't, you and I had this conversation that I'm one of the board members who missed the embedded green, and that's my fault. That being said, in my 2.5 years, there's never been a practice or a procedure that we've done it this way. And maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I'd like to go back to Carrie's comment or statement. When did that committee finish their work last summer, Carrie? Did you say August and July? My question is, why are we not honoring the work of that committee? And why are we not, why is that recommendation not, as Gordon said, why is that recommendation, why was that not put in rules for a vote as soon as that happened? What's the delay between July and now, and the purpose for that delay?
Yeah, so again, I understand and I recognize the work that went into the state's federal plan for the purposes of complying with ESSA, but I'm not aware of any recommendation delivered to this board about the state's accountability rule under 511 IAC 6.2. And I'm not aware of any action that this board has taken to approve any recommendations about the state's accountability rule under that site.
So how did we get to where we are today?
Again, I went off of the expressed intent of the board that there be alignment to the extent possible with the ESSA plan.
And we did that. We submitted that to ESSA. ESSA says you're one of the top 10, Indiana, you're one of the top 10 submittals in the nation, and specifically pointed out the strength of our accountability plan that was submitted. So I'm wondering why we're here. Why are we doing this out of order? And maybe these recommendations will be great and terrific. And why are we not acknowledging and honoring the report back from the feds?
So I think we are. We are one of the top 10 states in the nation for identifying targeted and comprehensive schools. That says nothing about the way that our state imposes consequences for A through F grades at the state level. So I want to be clear that these are two very different things. How we identify schools for federal purposes and how we are required to identify schools at the federal level is different than the grades we assign to schools to determine whether the state board will impose consequences under state law.
I'm having trouble with that, Chad, to be real honest with you, because the feds are saying you guys are terrific, and we're ignoring that.
And again, I am not, if that is the route that this board wants to go, there is no pride of authorship in this draft. This is simply a reflection of what the board expressed their intent to be. I mean, I will amend this draft until the board approves language that we can move forward with.
Okay, you said what the board intended. I would suggest that members of the board have expressed an intention to change some of that.
And correct, and only a few members of the board expressed an interest in sticking to ESSA exactly.
Brian brought up past practices, and then what your explanation, doesn't, Brian, that reflect an agreement to Gordon's comments about accept and acknowledge what was here, and then change it from, if we want to change it, do it during the discussion period from the field, and express those changes then, and you know, a lack of that or dismissal of that is, as Gordon, I agree with what you're stating, is it suggests a lack of transparency of what we're trying to do. And if, what's the hurry? And if we want to get input from the field, great, let's do that, but let's do it from the original proposal.
I don't have a response to that.
I have a question, I guess, in follow-up to Dr. Yeager's points. The first one is, do we need to review again the purpose of ESSA versus the purpose of state accountability? Because I'm hearing in that comment maybe that that's something that bears repeating in terms of how they're used and therefore how the elements within them would logically vary. And then another point of clarification, I think, and I may be misspeaking, Dr. Yeager, but the agency that made the entity that made the comments that you're referencing in the legislative insight was Bellwether, right? Which is an independent third-party agency, not the federal government. So I think that's another point of distinction, again, when we're citing to these facts, that we need to make sure that we're clear on the entity that's making those observations so that, again, when we're using these authorities to help inform our decisions, that is all clear. So that's not a commendation from the federal government, but from a third-party reviewer, talking about the plan. So Chad, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so a couple different things here.
Representing the feds, right? Those third parties are representing the feds, and they reviewed our plan probably as well, I'm guessing, as well as other plans from across the nation.
So under federal law, Indiana's Department of Education was tasked with and responsible for developing an ESSA plan, a state plan to deliver to the feds in the manner prescribed by federal law. With that, the superintendent and her department put together a working group to discuss ESSA. They consulted the governor's office. They consulted the state board, which they were required to do by federal law for purposes of determining a federal system of identifying schools for comprehensive and targeted support, period. Out of that, the department went forward with the recommendation that they use A through F grades, similar to what we do here in Indiana, and that's how that system was developed. The State Board of Education is bound by Indiana law, and Indiana law requires that you do A through F grades. Federal law does not require that the department use A through F grades. Federal law allows a lot of different things, colors, 5 different colors, smiley faces, I don't know. But I think that what the department was trying to do in that was align the two systems, which again has been expressed. I'm not suggesting that there was ever interest in deviating completely between the two systems, but there is a difference between federal law and state law. This board is bound by state law.
And I think it's important to realize from the beginning, and Chad, you're exactly correct, we were trying to get things aligned because I think it's very confusing to schools, to families, to communities to have multiple accountability systems with multiple consequences, and that's where we're heading. Now, it's interesting because the department and the General Assembly and the governor's office really seem to be saying, get to one system. Let's attack the graduation rate issue so that we don't have this problem with two. Let's look at all these different entities. Let's look at college and career readiness so that we can get to something that makes sense. So I think the charge is we are trying so that we don't have this ESSA plan that is foreign to our state accountability system. Now, we knew coming out of ESSA that we would have to make modifications because we knew something would come out of grad pathways. We didn't know what was happening with graduation rate. We knew everything was kind of in limbo. So we left there saying this was our gentleman's agreement. No one voted. Our gentleman's agreement that this is what we could send into ESSA and feel comfortable after hours and several meetings across the state and lots of feedback. We knew we would get to this point. So there are changes that need to be made. I think it goes back to I think for some of us, the issue became, how did we get here? Where did that language come? More of a process versus the need is there. We have to do it. We have to address some of these things. It's been more, I think, a concern about the whole entire process. So, and just because we all realize we're going to have to make changes to address some of the things that have happened, and we will continue to make changes. We will have to as we go. So just like today, it came up with the special populations versus the exclusively special populations. We should never be in that situation where we're asking people to go again or to interpret the law in a creative way for one set of schools and for another. So we know we have to tweak it. So the decision today, I think, is do we start from the ESSA, as Gordon brought up, that standpoint that is familiar to the field, that showed transparency, or do we go forward as our starting point with the ESSA plus green? Those are really the two decisions we have to make, correct? What language are we comfortable with? We've all had time to look at it. We've all had input into it. We're never going to hash it out today, all the tweaks that need to be made, correct?
And I would suggest that we all have not had input into it unless you consider the green language, right? I mean, there are board members who requested the language. So how did we get here? Board members contacted staff, asked staff to conduct research, and asked staff to draft language.
I'm okay with that if there's a process to be purposeful to seek that out. If you're taking it and picking it from certain members and others don't know that's happening, that's a problem.
I would say, really quickly, nothing was cherry-picked from any board member.
I'm not saying you did. I just said maybe
I'll get that email that asked for, I'm just checking, because once again, we're using this again. Did we,
prior to the green. I'm sorry. I know we did it after the green.
November 16th.
That was the green. Prior to the green.
Right. So prior to that, no, that the feedback was, or the requests were board member initiated, asking staff to look into basically these 6 areas. That's how we got here.
And so now we're here.
Yes.
So we have a decision to make as a board. What's going to be our baseline? Do we want that to look like ESSA, or do we want that to look like ESSA with the green, or are there modifications we're going to sit out and hash out today?
Well, I'll move to approve the proposed rule that staff has presented.
Second.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, Tony?
I move to approve the proposed rule presented by staff.
Second.
Is that with the modified language with the green, correct? Okay, and we have a second. Any other discussion on that?
I have, just to reiterate very briefly, I mean, I support what you're saying, and, you know, I know, Chad, that you are a little bit in the tug of war, right? So I appreciate the staff, you know, you have to make decisions along the way as you're getting input from board members. Okay, what do I include in this language that's going to go before the board, and what don't I include, and where do we start? I guess our point is just, in my view, every single word that's in green can be part of a submittal as part of a formal process. So it's really just where does it come in? Do we start day one with this, which is really just come from board members? Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's just kind of a process standpoint. And I know we can make changes. I know there's going to be amendments, but to me, it's what we're saying to the public, which is, you know, we're starting here instead of kind of where we felt like we had that general consensus. So again, I'm not criticizing any member of the board. I'm not criticizing who have an absolute right to give input to our staff as we develop this. I'm not criticizing our staff. They're doing their jobs. All I'm saying is, for me, as one board member, from a process standpoint, I could support moving forward with the rulemaking process using the baseline information or the baseline language that I felt there was general consensus on. And then once we move forward once it gets published and we move forward, then everyone has their fair chance, whether it's a member of this board or whether it's a teacher from the smallest school in Indiana will have the opportunity to give their input as part of the process. So that's all kind of I'm saying. And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong. It's just that's how I feel the process would be best served.
Any other questions or comments with the motion on the table?
So I will make, if this motion, let me just say to my fellow board members, if this motion, if the majority of the board feels that we should go back and start with the language from, you know, that does not include the new language, I will go ahead and make a motion, or maybe another board member can make that motion if this main motion fails. Hopefully that's clear. So if you were to vote against this, we would just go back. We could start the rulemaking process with the original language, move forward as I've discussed.
I think
the motion on the table is to use the language that has been modified with staff, and there's a second, and we're continuing comments. BJ?
I guess my question is, if we go back, because I truly have zero preference in where we start.
Zero what?
I said I have zero preference in which one we use. I don't care. Because where we land is what's important to me. But I think I err on the side of caution with Tony, as I believe, as a teacher, I would want to know what the people sitting up here are thinking. So if we can go go back to the original like Gordon's talking, but in some, I don't know how else we include them besides making them green so you can see the changes. I would think the field would want to know what this board is thinking. And again, me voting to move this forward doesn't mean I support everything that's in green. That's not the case. But it is me voting to move this forward. So my question is there a way to go back to the original and still include the board's comments on the initial document, or is that doing what Tony asked?
So this document was here for your consideration. This document is not in the form required by LSA, and it is not a final document.
Okay.
I think if I understand what you're saying is, can we leave this document on the website as a staff recommendation to adopt a rule, while at the same time putting forward a proposed rule that doesn't match? Yeah, these are two separate things.
I think that's confusing. No, that wasn't my request.
And I believe me, the field does know, don't they? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but the field does know what's on the table right now.
But I don't see a reason to change it.
It was a good point. The docket, the rulemaking docket, will have the official language.
I don't want two separate dockets. That's not what I was requesting. That's really confusing. My question was, is there any way to red line copy this, or do you have to provide, this is the language, this is where we're starting?
I will have to provide to LSA the language.
This is the starting point, period.
Yep.
Okay, that's my question.
And is it accurate, and I'm just asking, is it accurate that when you're in the rulemaking process, if changes are made, they have to be linked to certain comments?
That's right.
So it's not willy-nilly changes.
That's right.
So I want people to understand that this is a big deal of what's going through, because if we're going to make changes, it has to be linked to comments.
So once
and is it one comment or multiple? How's that work?
It just has to be linked back to comments. Yeah. So unlike the legislative process where they are able to amend their own bills, once the language is approved for publication as a proposed rule, that language is the language that will be out there. Any changes to that language that have to be either technical in nature or tied back to a public comment.
And that's the only requirement?
Yes, that's rulemaking.
Or board comments, but.
Yes.
Yeah.
So essentially, we could get back to the same place we are right now with board comments. If we were to go back to a different baseline with ESSA, and the board members were to propose the same things that may have been proposed to get us to the green, one comment could have those reinserted.
Yes.
And Vince, those comments, in my view, should be discussed in a public meeting. It's not provided just kind of by email or whatever. We should all sit up and talk about those comments. Because I agree with some of the comments that have been made. To me, it's more of just kind of where do we start from, and then we all can sit in a public meeting and have that discussion about, how the language should be changed, rather than kind of this got incorporated because one board member said this, and this got incorporated because another board member.
Dr. Freitas?
I had an opportunity to respond, and in my response and reviewing the entire document, there were several items that I was going to recommend to change but did not, because I wanted to hear from the field. And knowing that we're going to move forward with public comment on this, that will influence a final decision, at least for me, on this particular rule. And so I looked at what was submitted in that vein, that there's another opportunity for final approval. Final approval is not today, right?
Right. This is the start.
All we're doing is sending it out to the public. Plus, I wanted, as soon as possible, input from the field on certain kind of issues that I felt that I didn't feel totally qualified to make a policy decision on that without input. So that's why I support the motion. I'd like to get it out there. I'd like to get public input in. I'd like to start discussions with other board members in a public setting soon. I don't want to wait several months to do this. And so I understand the process takes a little time to get the public comments in and so forth, but I'm envisioning within the next several months that we'll have maybe a special meeting or some other kind of meeting where we really get down into the details. The other point I want to make is the use of advisory committees. As was mentioned by a previous speaker, I did serve on an advisory committee, And it was a Department of Education committee, it wasn't a board committee. And I see those advisory committees as advisory to the board, because we receive a lot of input, and sometimes there is consensus around certain issues, but sometimes there is not. And sometimes the business community sees things differently, principals may see things in a different way, teachers may see things in a different kind of way. And so it's not easy just to abdicate our responsibility and say we'll form an advisory committee and then accept their recommendations. So I'm saying we should do that process, but everything funnels back to this board, and we have to consider all kinds of views and then make a decision on that point. So it's not as easy as just accepting a recommendation from this or that committee. So again, I'm supporting this motion that we move forward to release this to the public for comments.
Any other questions or comments, Mary Ann?
Yes, I just want to comment that it feels to me that there will be opportunities to have input and for the board to process that input. I have a lot of questions, not saying that I do or don't support what's in the green. I actually had a chance to run it by a few of our area superintendents, and I think they just need more time to think about what the ramifications are. And so today, I'm sitting here wanting to start with the baseline, only because I think there will be opportunities for us to discuss moving forward, for us to have more input, for us to talk to more of the people out in the field and know what the ramifications are of adding to the proposal before we start in a place that we're going to have to talk through it no matter what anyway. So just somebody asked where we all were, and I just wanted to make sure I stated that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments?
One last, I just think this is obviously a big deal. Yeah. I think there are a lot of things in this that I think are very good that are part of the green. And there are other things I question. Okay? But I think having the opportunity for public comment, the thing I want to, and this is my own personal view of this, I want us to be able to have a forum to have those public discussions. I don't want to be in the same place that we were with Pathways. We get public comment and then we come to a board meeting and take a vote. I think we need more opportunity to process that as a board. That's just my own personal view. I can support moving forward with the proposed rule, but I want to make sure we have time to vet this.
I think staff is happy to provide whatever forum the board would like to give you the opportunity to vet any comments that come through.
Any other questions or comments before we vote?
Madam Chair, one last comment. The ESSA accountability model does not include graduation pathways. I mean, the brand new metric here that's under consideration, or that will probably in some form or another be in the new accountability scheme, is going to include graduation pathways. So for us not to release something for public comment that doesn't include or take into consideration graduation pathways is just disingenuous.
Ready to vote?
If I can just respond to that, I mean, that was the original purpose of my motion at the beginning of the day today, was to discuss this today and wait a month before we settled on language. I just feel like that would be the more prudent approach. But, again, if this motion before us fails, I'm more than willing to make a motion to either delay so we can agree on where our baseline is and include, again, I agree with you, Tony, we should probably include the graduation pathways, but there's a whole lot of other stuff in there that I feel probably shouldn't be in there today. Okay, so if this motion does fail, more than willing to start with our baseline that we've talked about. If it passes, then it passes. So.
Roll call. Are we ready?
I have a question.
Dr. Yeager?
Yes. So for clarification points, as Mr. Henry has stated, if this is put off a month, we still can meet the timelines for 18-19 implementation based upon
if this board approves
feedback.
If this board approves language sometime in the next 28 days, but no, if you wait until the February meeting to approve language it will likely be too late at that point.
Tell me again the
Case is right about that time.
tell me again the magic of this being implemented for 18-19 school year and not 19-20 school year.
The magic is just having a final rule in place before that school year starts. And that's dictated by the statutory timeline that's required to promulgate a rule. It can be a lengthy process.
The 28 calendar days you're talking about?
28 calendar days until we can publish a proposed rule. The notice of intent was put out today, so that by statute, 28 days until we publish the notice of public hearing as well as the proposed language, or the language for the proposed rule.
Using Mr. Henry's thoughts, if we apply this, the original, prior to green, and that would mean by tomorrow, whatever the publication date is, but the next day, the green can appear. Is that correct?
Sorry, can you say that again?
The green can appear, and those would be suggestions as feedback to the board. Is that right?
I don't quite follow.
After the language is published.
Yeah, after the language is published.
There will be a public hearing. Public comments will be accepted, like I said, through phone, through mail, through email, as well as the public hearings.
So whenever that occurs, then the green could be immediate feedback along with whatever else feedback we get from across the field, correct?
Yeah, but I think that we envision that as being feedback decided upon by the board. I don't see staff unilaterally incorporating public comments into it. So immediate feedback, no. Feedback from the board at the next board meeting, yes.
Okay. I see Gordon shaking his head, so I'm going to not ask any more questions.
Dr. Bertram?
I have another question. To be clear, get feedback. Will those changes be made? Come back as a board and discussion around the feedback we receive, then decide as a board whether to make changes to this draft. Is that what will happen?
Yeah, please, Brian.
Yeah. At some point, we have to vote on every single piece of this.
Absolutely.
Individually.
Yeah, so that's correct, and there's flexibility there, and it's again, just going back to the last time we went through this, we created sort of the board will get the full text of every comment, but we also created a matrix, and I think with REPA 3, we had like 80-some different categories where we could lump them in and say, here's what the public is saying. So the board can kind of have a more, more targeted approach to looking at what the public's saying and what changes the board may or may not
On each topic?
I mean, potentially. I mean, usually it tends to boil down to a handful of issues, 2 or 3, and then you get a lot of comments on some things that are unrelated and so on and so forth. But
so, for instance, excuse me, the well-rounded educational development indicator as a category. Mm-hmm. We will get all the feedback on that, and we will come back as a board, have that discussion, and decide what that final rule will look like, what that final draft looks like.
Correct.
Once we agree on that as a board, what happens at that point? That become the final draft?
On that particular indicator or all of them? Okay.
Obviously, but
when that happens, that's where the flexibility is built in. So that's where we could say, all right, we're going to have a draft, and this may, we may have to have some work sessions where we have, all right, this is the draft final rule based on, public input, feedback we've received, and also staff support, both, in doing research on what other states are doing. And then at that point, the board can discuss it so we can get an idea of, but at some point there has to be an end. And so, we can try to work that out so it's as flexible as possible. So that comments considered all the way up into the end and considering what the final draft rule looks like. But at some point after that, the board will have to.
It makes so much more sense to me. Put this out in front of the public and get feedback on these issues than it does trying to build it up to these things. Because through that process, there's going to be less time for people to react to a final rule than it will be to react to this proposal.
And that's been our intent. So in the past, staff has created a proposed rule and given it to you. And so in this sense, we were trying to be more proactive and trying to put something out there that's more meaningful than just a bland, whatever the starting point would be, so the public can make,
If we started without any of the green as the proposal going forward, and if there is belief that this green, and I mean, obviously there's going to be discussion about individual pieces of it, but if we end up with a final proposal based on comments around what is in green, and that becomes a final proposal, we're talking significant differences.
That's correct.
To me, that we'd be better off pulling back than trying to build up through a 58-day process.
I think from a staffing perspective, that's
In other
what's been
words,
so.
start where we've got it.
I think start where we're at, let people see it, and let's vet it. Right? If people disagree with it, we'll have information, and we can have that discussion publicly.
I think that's why Steph doesn't understand the transparency.
Most people would be more comfortable with us eliminating something from this than adding something to it, particularly something so substantial or significant as what's in green.
But again, it's up to the board to.
So we have a motion and a second. Last comment, Dr. Freitas.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to a response that was made to be sure that I'm clear. So if we go back to I'll call it the bare bones or the initial proposal from staff before board members had an opportunity and some responded to add some language. There was a comment made about adding a comment that would add language to the rule. And someone said you can't add language to a rule once it's initially submitted for public comment. And so let me give you a specific example. So I suggested adding some language to the rule, and if we go back to the initial rule, my suggestion would be taken out, which is absolutely fine. But at the time of public comment or final approval, could that comment be considered?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, the changes can be made based on public comment.
Dr.
So
Yeager?
I would have to make a public comment in order to have it recorded and then, or by virtue of serving on the board, I could put in a public comment at the end?
Public comment, comments from the board, comments from agency staffs on both sides, comments from the Attorney General's office regarding technical changes, all of those things.
Yeah, the downside to that is I'd like to get public comment on my comments.
Right.
And so if we don't put this draft that you're recommending out there, then I'm not getting public comment on my comment. And I'd hate to last minute stick something in and have the field really upset with that. I want to get public input. And so that's why I'm having a hard time with this, that I don't want to stick a provision in there last minute that the public has not had an opportunity to respond to.
Brian, stay there.
Dr. Yeager?
Sorry, Brian. You talked about a spreadsheet of some sort that you kind of categorize comments.
Yes.
How does that work? Explain that. Give me details on that.
Yeah, so it varies from rule to rule, but in general, when we get, in the past, when we've gotten public comments, and so, for example, the last accountability rule I'll use as an example, last time we amended the state accountability rule, we put out the rule, and then we were able to put public comments into categories for the board. So, in other words, we had maybe 100 comments total. Actually, we had 2,000. Let's say 100. 10 of those related to growth and proficiency being 50-50, and 20 of those related to some other indicator. And so we're able to kind of make it more concise, so the board can digest it in that sense and see where the real issues are. As far as the concentration of public comments. And so, I mean, that's one example. And so that way it kind of narrows it down for the board. Now, you're going to get the full text of all the public comments, but what does tend to happen is there is a concentration of comments around usually a handful of issues that we can really narrow it down to.
Thank you. Not done.
Okay.
at what point do we say, through the public comments that are sent through the portal, I guess is what the proper term is, into your spreadsheet, at what point do we determine that that's a significant response?
Well, the law requires it up until the public hearing. Now, if we're going to do more than, and typically what we've done is, on these types of rules, more than one public hearing, and we've allowed public comment all the way up until the very, very last point where it can be considered.
You didn't answer my question. Let me ask it a different way.
Okay.
What number of responses do you need to see? I'll just pick anything. Well-rounded education, okay. If we get well-rounded education development and we have X amount of concerns regarding that topic, when does that come back to the board as a recommendation that says there's concern out there in the field?
So even if there's one comment to one area, that will be a separate item in the summary that we provide. So you'll get a summary of every comment, even if it's one, but what you'll see is a concentration in probably a handful of areas.
So you'll not bring back to us anything that says we have 250 concerns regarding well-rounded education? We
will. We will bring the number of comments surrounding what issue, and we can even sometimes, we can separate them out.
If you have emails and contacts and phone calls from across the state that says, these are our concerns, and we're concerned with 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever number it is,
yeah.
and you reach whatever that level is, because I still haven't heard what that level is.
There is no threshold.
Inside of 1.
Yeah.
You reach whatever level that is that says there's a significant number of people across the state that have a concern with item 1, well-rounded educational development.
Or love it.
That's what I said. They have a concern about that. How do we find that out? I know you're going to send it to us, but when does the board get to the point where we say, this needs to be thrown out? People are obviously concerned about that.
Well, so our role as a staff will be to help the board digest a significant number of comments. That will have to come through discussions via, whether it be just in regular board meeting discussion items or through work sessions. And I can give you, again, going back to the REPA 3 example, where there were some areas. There was a career specialist permit. It was first called the adjunct permit. And that was one area of tension where there was disagreement among board members and the public. And so we actually brought that up as its own item on the agenda, and the board voted on that. I think it was like...
All right, I'll stop beating around the bush. We just had last month over 350 emails, and basically they all said, it's not that we don't like this, we just want input. And that didn't reach the table. And we had 700 people in attendance, and we had almost 100 testimonies, all saying the same thing. We kind of like some things here, but can you talk about this?
Well, I think that's in Title IV. So, I mean, we have to put something out in Title IV rulemaking to initiate public comment so something can be commented on. And that's just the way Title IV is laid out in law.
Well, I appreciate the fact that my colleagues up here have responded in the most appropriate way on both sides of this issue, and it's probably time to quit talking about it and make a vote.
Can I ask one last question? I'm sorry.
Yes.
Brian, what would have happened if, because I didn't submit any comments, because honestly, I just assumed that we're going to go with the language and that you were getting input. But what if I had submitted language that was in direct opposition to my good friend, Dr. Freitas? What then?
I think that's an instance where we would have had to have an additional, have some more discussion. I mean, to my knowledge, we didn't receive conflicting feedback. Now, that's not a real issue because that can take place. And I'm already hearing that there's disagreement among the board board, but I think the best answer is we have 11 bosses and we're just trying to do the best, the best we can. But had you submitted something that conflicted with something another board member submitted, that's an example of at some point in time, like we did with REPA, we need to have the board vote on that and decide what direction it wants to go.
So we had 4 board members that said we want to make changes. So one board member is significant and 250 field responses is not significant. I am a little confused with that. So every board member that says we want this inserted, we insert it?
No, so no, that we just didn't have any, we didn't receive any feedback that was in direct conflict with each other at this point.
Okay, so the motion, yes.
Whether it's this or any other rulemaking process or legislation, doesn't a legislator typically in a staff, the legislative staff, develop a bill or a proposal that is submitted for consideration? We don't start with, we have a problem, now let's go out to public comment and see what people think about the problem, right? We start with a proposal. And that proposal comes from multiple perspectives, a lot of input from a lot of different people, correct?
Yes.
Including staff. And that's kind of what we have here. Asking people to give us feedback on this.
Correct.
We just need to have a process that we get the feedback and that we can react to it and vet it. I think that's going to be a critical piece.
And part of receiving feedback on our end as a support staff is we are looking to other states. Is this, we're not vetting it, but we are sort of in a sense. We're saying, is this something that makes sense in alignment with pathways? Is this something other states are doing, so on and so forth?
Your point, there are other states. I mean, there are a lot of things that are happening. It's not just in a vacuum, right? I mean, these are developed with a lot of information and a lot of input. Now we're asking for broader input. Thank you.
Roll call, please.
Yes.
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 No. Yes.
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 No.
No.
Yes. Next item on the agenda is election of chair and vice chair. We have a motion?
I nominate B.J. Watts to serve as vice chair, and I nominate Superintendent for Public Instruction, Dr. Jennifer McCormick, to serve as chair.
Second.
Any discussion? Roll call.
Does everyone accept the nomination?
Yes. It's a really good question today, though, Dr. Bertram. It's a very valid question today.
Okay, good. Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Assessment update, and this will be quick from Dr. Flores.
Good afternoon. Just a few updates to share with the board today. I wanted to highlight that this month we are out in the field and also conducting some WebExes to facilitate guidance related to the upcoming test administration windows. We've consolidated all of that into single sessions. So last year, before I came into the department, all of those were done per type of assessment. So we're trying to be most efficient with everyone's time as we move forward with that. The WIDA assessment window opened last week. iStar is scheduled to open starting on Monday. And I did want to spend most of this presentation just highlighting we have moved forward this week formally with contract execution for iLearn. So wanted to highlight some of those features. I know some of you participated in the review of proposals, and so again, I just wanted to thank the board both in reviewing the RFP SOW and in those discussions that we've had to support iLearn. I've really appreciated all of that feedback. So this is the logo that we'll start to present more formally to everyone so you can be familiar with that. Just to highlight, we did try to leverage several lessons learned over the last few years in terms of selecting our vendor. Again, we wanted to make sure that we had a stable delivery platform, and that was a key element of our discussion as we moved forward. Content development is also a significant change going forward. Previously in Indiana, we did a lot of our own content development, and we're actually going to be licensing banks of items that are aligned to our Indiana standards. We're going through an audit process this spring to ensure that just those items that align are what are used. There's several accessibility features that will be offered with the new assessment, and there's some additional detail to highlight that later in the presentation. Reporting is also something that we've worked on to make sure that that's expedited to the field going forward, and we feel like we have good options to support that. As you know from the IDOA process, AIR was selected as the vendor for us to move forward, and that's the contract that was executed this week. Just a quick overview.
Little more prescriptive, given some states' rights, but they fought back on that one. So we updated that. The academic progress indicator, this was more of an issue of semantics and placement than anything. Specifically for the academic progress indicator, it was exclusive for your elementary and middle schools. However, we had indicated we would include growth at the high school level as an academic progress indicator. They said we had to move that to the academic achievement indicator per the language in the statute. So it is still incorporated in there since we'll have to utilize the federal system for next fall for letter grades that come out next fall. So we moved that to academic achievement and maintained the current weight that was proposed. It just got shifted over. Graduation rate, their feedback was in regard to the 5-year improvement score we utilize. They wanted a little more clarification that we're utilizing the same cohort of students when we look at the 5-year improvement score rather than 2 different cohorts of students. While we had included that language in there 2 times, we added it again to reinforce that we are utilizing the same cohort of students on that 5-year graduation rate improvement score. The next point of feedback was in regard to the school quality student success for high schools. Am I on the right one? Yes. Which was our college and career readiness achievement rate, which currently reflects the CCR component that we have with AP, IB, dual credit, and industry certification. Currently, our rule only looks at graduates for this component. But the feedback from US Ed was that if we're utilizing this as the 5th indicator, we have to incorporate all students in the cohort, not just graduates. So this will now look at all students in the cohort regardless of graduation status.
Next was a request for further explanation on the A through F system, specifically the point scale. We had incorporated the point scale, but they wanted us to incorporate it in another section, so copy and paste, which we did, just to inform them and remind them that we utilize a 0 to 100 point scale with the A through F system. Next was on the weighting of indicators and the requirement to describe weighting of each indicator and alignment with meaningful differentiation. This is where we were told that we would be required to cap growth at 100 points and all indicators at 100 points given our point scale.
All right, so because currently under the rule that we have, growth points can go up to 175, correct?
So our table goes up to 175 points awarded. I mean, you'd have to have literally every student in your school earning high growth and be high performers. So that's a great group of students to have, but that's not very many schools. So,
but that's what it is. It's 175.
0 to 175 point scale.
So theoretically, if you max out your growth, you could have a school that say only has 25% of the students that are testing as proficient, but still end up getting an A.
Yeah, I mean, math works out in my head right now that way. Mm-hmm.
A scientific calculation there.
Yeah, it was kind of like In a Beautiful Mind, where it's just
Maggie, they think you're kidding.
I know you.
I'm like, she did work it out. Let me tell you, she's talking about
I've seen that before. What are the real implications?
With the cap on growth. So I think that the point Mr. Walker made is probably the biggest impact you're going to see. So given that schools could earn bonus points for growth, it could counter what you would see in proficiency or graduation rate or multiple measures.
And probably maybe almost as big of an impact is those schools that we have allowed to go only on growth. Now that will no longer be acceptable to federal levels. So we have those schools for 3 years that are growth only and look pretty darn good. And so now when that proficiency gets calculated in, it's going to be interesting. So that will be a huge impact for some of our schools.
Have we done that impact study?
No, we have not, but you know, I think given that the state average on growth points last year, I think was 97 for elementary and middles and like 96 for high schools. That can give you kind of an idea of what you would see.
Calculations?
Yeah, no, it's going to affect 29. Yeah, no, I have no idea.
Thank you.
Sure. There were 2 points of feedback on meaningful differentiation. One was in regard to small schools and how they would be evaluated. We had put in the plan that if they don't meet the minimum end size of 20, then no grade would be calculated. We removed in our ESSA plan the aggregation practice. However, US Ed said this would not fly and that we had to have some way to evaluate our small schools. So we have put in some placeholder language, given that hopefully the rulemaking process will help to address this as well. Essentially, the language we put in is calculates an average score over 3 years for the small schools to utilize their data over 3 years.
You're talking about the language that we just...
No, I'm talking about the language we put in the ESSA plan that we submitted on January 8th.
In terms of alignment of accountability around rules around small schools, correct?
Right, and if my memory serves me correctly, I think that provides them with a null grade, which is in conflict with what US Ed told us.
That's where I was going, so.
Yeah, so this is one area where I was trying to incorporate feedback at the last minute, where the rule deviates from ESSA. As Maggie pointed out with small schools, and this idea of aggregating 3 years worth of data, the way the rule is currently drafted is that they will receive a null grade, as well as new schools, rather than being growth only, because using growth as the only indicator as opposed to all of the indicators is a completely separate model. Those schools will also receive a null grade under the proposed language that you approved.
So what you're saying, what I'm hearing, I believe, is that conflict with what we have to do.
Again, I think that's differentiating between the federal and the state, yes, there are absolutely areas in the proposed language that comply with state law while at the same time run afoul of some of the provisions in ESSA, yes.
How does that get reconciled?
So in the proposed rule, the way it's been drafted right now is that while small schools would receive a null grade, it authorizes the department to calculate their placement for federal purposes based on whatever the department sees fit.
Wait a minute, because I think you changed, maybe I missed what you said, but you made the proposed that we voted on comply with federal.
To the extent possible,
possible. Okay.
So there are some differences, and this is one. I think that the other thing that will have to be updated as the rulemaking process goes on is one of the first things that Maggie touched on with the participation rate, including students, not all students, but students that are there for 162 days. I think that might be the only other thing that has not been incorporated. But
let me ask it another way. If we were to approve in a future exact language that's written now in green, that would comply obviously with state law, but not be in compliance with federal law.
Correct, and I can work with Maggie to identify specific instances where the proposed rule deviates from ESSA beyond just what was done.
That was where my earlier comment, which I was trying to make the point as far as the General Assembly, the Governor's office, our office, we're trying to get as much aligned as possible because it is extremely confusing to have multiple accountability systems with multiple punitive consequences, and it's things like that of why, we really, all along our message has been get as much alignment as we can get. It just makes sense, but we will continue that message. Some of it would have to take legislative change as well, so we're cognizant of that, and so is the General Assembly, so they are being very good partners right now.
And like I said, I'll work with Maggie to ensure
the General Assembly's being good.
Language in the proposed rule that deviates from the requirements of ESSA is brought to your attention. I'll make sure that you have that access to that.
It's too late in the day to get into this subject again because we've talked about this multiple times. I can't remember all the other meetings, but the question about whether or not the state and the federal system must legally be aligned, I think the answer is no to that. That it does not have to be, but then we get into a practicality.
Right.
Would it be better? And Chief of Staff wanted to make a comment on this? Or not? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that it's within our prerogative to do that. We're not banned from having two different systems, but we need to consider the implications and consequences of that. There may be a good rationale why we have some components separate, that we don't want the federal government dictating what we're doing in Indiana, for example, but yet we don't want to drive the field crazy with multiple systems.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think Alabama is an example of a state that's done that. They've created a system that they'll identify comprehensive and targeted schools for federal purposes, but they're going to apply A through F grades.
You are correct. Alabama is the state.
So my question is it wise for us to do that as opposed to required? And if so, would we be better off to get that language in a proposal now, or do we fix it later?
I hope that's not a question for me.
Matt?
Go.
So there are some areas where there will just be conflicts. So state law says for dropout recovery schools, those schools do not feed into state A through F accountability. But what's in the ESSA plan, those indicators go out and are reported to the federal government for purposes of targeted and comprehensive support. So there's a difference between state accountability and federal support.
So in the small school scenario, the federal government does not give letter grades, correct?
The federal government doesn't give letter grades.
That's what I mean. So we would report those schools to the federal government under their rules, but in our state accountability rule, there would be a null.
Right.
Got it.
Right.
We're good. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. The second point of feedback on this was in regard specifically to the schools for the blind and the deaf. They wanted further clarification as to why they are exempt from accountability. We clarified that they don't meet the definition of school under Indiana code, and that was provided to them in writing to provide some further context and explanation to that point. The last point of feedback was in regard to identification and exit criteria for comprehensive and targeted support. We had indicated that a school would exit comprehensive support after attaining 2 consecutive C or higher letter grades. They wanted just some further explanation as to why we chose that threshold, specifically what it was about that point value, and if there is flexibility, let's say that the bottom 5% is now, currently right now it all falls within the F letter grade range. If that bottom 5% were to then fall in the D and F range or potentially C and F range, what would happen to that threshold? So we clarified why we went with C currently, given our current status of schools that would be identified for comprehensive support, and then clarified that we would reevaluate and adjust that exit criteria threshold to move upward. And that is it.
Any further questions for Maggie? Dr. Yeager?
Thank you. So these items are the feedback we got from the feds and our response to them.
Correct.
And we had, what, 14 days? Am I correct with that? To respond?
Not counting like Christmas and everything.
Okay, so not holidays, but 14 work days. What's the timeline for expected response from the feds again?
I will defer to Patrick.
At their pleasure?
I don't know. It's like, it'll be within the 120-day window of original submission, which was why the timeline was 10 days, not 14 days. But we're going to be waiting to hear back hopefully pretty soon.
Yeah, I'd just like to echo from my colleagues up here, way to go, staff. Nice job.
Any other comments or questions? Thank you, Ms. Maggie. Thank you, Patrick. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you. We are adjourned.
Oh, I know. February 1, baby. February 1.
80, unplugged.
Yeah, day drink.
First thing in the morning for breakfast.
Exactly. Breakfast. Harry Truman style.